And now I want to bring in someone who just spoke with the president in the last 24 hours, Mayor Quinton Lucas of Kansas City, Missouri. He was one of nearly 200 Democratic mayors on that video call with President Biden last night. Mayor, it's good to see you this morning. And first of all, congratulations on, I know you have a new little one at home. I'm sure you didn't get much sleep, but we appreciate you waking up early to join us. What was the president's message on that call yesterday, and how did he come across to you?
Well, I was one of three mayors who had the chance to pose a question to him. We talked about my child. He talked about largely how he connects with the American people. I think forgotten in all of the discussion over recent weeks is that President Biden is someone who does have that connection still in Black communities in America, with labor unions, and in working class America. What I talked about was some of the time with him that he has spent in Michigan that I've been able to in places like Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, and beyond. And the fact that people are still talking about real issues each and every day. And so I think what he shared was that he is firmly in the race. He shared that he does look to everyone for even more support from mayors and others who are on the ground in America's communities. And frankly, for a conversation that took place between 8 and 8:30 p.m., he was vigorous, he was engaged, he was witty, he was funny, he was everything you'd expect.
You mentioned you were one of three mayors who got to ask a question, and you asked how you can help with his campaign. What did he say? How should mayors, state Democrats, local Democrats, not only reassure voters, but win over voters for Biden?
You know, I think that much of it was, how do you focus on the real issues that people talk about? And once you get past kind of some of the palace intrigue, and I respect anyone with questions about the next president of the United States, it's an important issue. But people are talking about grocery prices. He referenced that with us. People continue to talk about public safety in their communities. It's those kind of meat and potatoes issues that I think he really asked us to focus on. So it wasn't necessarily us writing op-eds in the New York Times or in any publication. It was us continuing to say what we already say and to do in many ways what mayors uniquely do each and every day, which is answer real kitchen table issues, which I think President Biden is both trying to do in this campaign and has largely done as president. This is somebody who's talking about Social Security. He's talking about health insurance prices and beyond, instead of actually just talking about, I think, politics in Washington.
You described the president as showing vigor. Do you share any of the concerns about the president that we've heard from some Democrats in Washington, including Senator Bennett and several members of the House?
You know, I don't. I recognize there are differences in all of us, but I am a man who is still barely in his 30s. I have a 3-year-old child and a 3-week-old child. And I think President Biden is the best candidate for the future of this country. I had the opportunity, I guess I'll call it, for a few minutes to watch a President Trump rally in part last night, where he seemed to speak in complete gibberish. I mean, what we're forgetting is actually not just the long-term governing record, but the fact that President Biden is typically providing substance to each and every issue that is raised. He gave us lots of substance last night, as opposed to just kind of shouting about, I think President Trump was mentioning a beautiful woman and saying he can't call her beautiful. I mean, just these sorts of things where if you actually look at a real comparison, President Biden is clearly someone who is not only more competent than President Trump, but is more accomplished in the presidency itself.
Well, Mayor Quinton Lucas, thank you so much for offering your perspective and your insights into your conversation with the president. We appreciate you joining us.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn. MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.